Welcome to the Bottom Tribe Network.
You know, it doesn't matter what walk of life you come from, your race, religion, whatever. Chances are that the legacy of HBCUs and their graduates affect more than one aspect of your everyday life. HBCU ubiquity.
Yeah. Welcome aboard.
Welcome to a new episode of the HBCU Ubiquity Podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Joyner Jr. Question: what's the overall best college or university in America? Everyone's entitled to their own opinion on that one, but what criteria did you consider when you came up with your answer to that question? What makes a college or university the best, or for that matter, the best of the best? Is it the famous alumni? Is it the cost? You know, the more expensive the college is, the better the education they provide? Or how about the size of the school's endowment, or the amount and different types of majors that a school offers? Or maybe it's faculty that constitutes a school as being, quote unquote, the best. You know, the number of professors with PhDs, or published research, or awards and recognitions. It may be a combination of the factors that I just mentioned. One person whose take I want to get on this question is Dr. Larry Irvin, Chief of Staff at the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools Commission on Colleges, or SACS for short. In fact, let me take a moment to properly tee that up since I kind of jumped from one subject to the next. So, SACS is the accrediting body for all colleges and universities from Virginia down to Florida and across to Texas. A SACS accreditation means that a school's finances and academic offerings are sound and in good standing, and SACS accreditation is recognized by the U.S. Department of Education, Florida State, UVA, Ole Miss, Hampton, Tougaloo, the entire Southern University system, and the entire Texas A&M system. All of those and more fall under SACS jurisdiction. In other words, if you're in the South and you don't have SACS accreditation, it's hard for your students to get federal financial aid like Pell Grants and work study. And it may be a combination of the factors that I just mentioned. But one person whose take I want to get on this question is Dr. Larry Irvin, Chief of Staff at the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools Commission on Colleges, or SACS for short. Dr. Irvin recently served as the chairman of the board for SACS and has been a part of numerous visits and in-depth studies for colleges and universities of all sizes, types, and reputations. And he's done this long enough to know what works, what doesn't work, and for, as far as this conversation goes, what the best looks like and does so as to be considered the best. In this episode, Dr. Irvin and I will talk about best practices for higher education, not just regarding HBCUs, but for colleges and universities in general. Oh, and did I mention that Dr. Irvin is also a former HBCU president? This is going to be a real talk conversation about where our schools are, how they get to that next level, and why they need to be reaching the next level. So sit back or continue doing whatever you're doing right now, but enjoy. And thanks for listening. Welcome to another episode of the new HBCU Ubiquity Podcast. Welcome back to HBCU Ubiquity. I'm joined now by the former president of Houston-Tillotson University and current chief of staff of the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools Commission on Colleges, also known as SACS, Dr. Larry L. Irvin. Dr. Irvin, how's everything in Atlanta today?
Everything is going well, just very hot.
Yeah, I love the South. So, Dr. Irvin, to jump right into it, and for the benefit of our listeners, can you define or describe the characteristics of a quote-unquote top-tier institution of higher education, be it public or private?
I think those are really two different questions. As it relates to public institutions, these are usually your flagship institutions that are supported by individual states and are recognized to be the lead institution in that particular state. They are usually well funded and have a tremendous research operation within their academic program and have a broad array of offerings, including specialty fields like law and medicine. They are typically selective in their nature in terms of the students that they enroll, giving some preference in the public institutions to students of a particular state, but also open to students from all over the country and indeed all over the world. Private institutions are a little different in that they depend largely for their resources upon their endowment. They have a strong reputation, stretching over many decades of years, and a strong resource base. Most of them have close to or over $1 billion in endowment, which allows them to have a broad array of programs as well, and again, to be selective in the students that they admit and to be able to target the particular kinds of students to create the class mixes that they desire. Those kinds of things you find at both public and private institutions that are considered top tier.
And so whether you're public or private, how about cost? Does cost factor into being considered top tier?
Well, yes and no. If you're a public institution and you're an in-state resident, the cost would be modest compared to going to a private top-tier institution. Included in the top-tier institutions are what we call the Ivy League schools, and their costs are approaching $50,000 a year. So that is expensive, whereas you could go to a highly regarded state-supported institution like Berkeley or the University of Texas at Austin or Michigan or North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and be able to attend for far less in terms of tuition dollars.
And Dr. Irvin, what about the faculty of these schools? Now, what would you say are the characteristics of the faculty composition that is of these schools?
Well, they will have faculty members that are highly regarded within their academic fields. They will be the trendsetters and the opinion makers within their academic fields as well. They will be heavily engaged in research, the publication of books that are used not only as textbooks in classes around the country, but also books that are used as reference books throughout a particular field. Their faculty members will almost always carry the terminal degree and be well recognized within their fields.
And just for the benefit of our listeners, Dr. Irvin, what would you say, can you define that term, the terminal degree?
A terminal degree is considered the highest degree within a professional field. Typically, it's the PhD for academia. We do consider some degrees, professional degrees, as terminal as well for those in fields like law, where the JD is awarded. Even though there's a higher degree than the JD, it is considered a terminal degree for most persons who are practicing law. However, in law school, on law school faculties, you will often find people who will have the master's in law after having earned the JD.
And if I heard you correctly in your previous answer, faculty members at these top-tier schools tend to be highly published. They're published a lot.
That is correct. I would mention that, the whole structure of the top-tier institutions lends itself to publication, with oftentimes faculty having graduate student assistants to help them with their teaching responsibilities and to serve as assistants in some of their research activities.
And being a graduate assistant like that, you can make some good money too, right?
Well, it depends. That's kind of an evasive answer, but some institutions, graduate assistants are paid fairly well. In others, they are not. And that, if you've been keeping up with some of the debate in higher education, you'll note that some graduate students who are serving as teaching assistants or lab assistants or research assistants are forming unions so that they can get some of the benefits that faculty receive.
And so, Dr. Irvin, what would you consider to be, among the top tier for HBCUs?
Well, it's a little different when you talk about HBCUs, because typically when you're talking about top tier institutions for the nation at large, you're talking about larger institutions. And most HBCUs are fairly small, with student populations somewhere around 1,000 students. There are some HBCUs that are fairly well endowed, having endowments over $100 million, which of course is not comparable to the top levels for the nation at large, but is top level for the cadre of institutions considered HBCUs. Those institutions too will be more selective in the students that they admit, and will branch out into expanding their research agenda within their institutions. There are, however, as you probably would note, top-tier institutions that are very mission-driven. Some of whom, both for the larger population of institutions in the country and for HBCUs, are limited to undergraduate enrollment. But they are, again, very selective, have a resource base, whether it's public or private, that will allow them to be selective and to pursue their mission directly.
Dr. Irvin, with that said, would you say that there are any broad strokes, or time frames, that HBCUs can can or maybe should imitate the top tier schools of their non-HBCU counterparts? Any best practices, so to speak?
Well, that question really begs a larger question that comes up a lot when we talk about HBCUs and higher education.
Okay.
When you're talking about HBCUs, as I said earlier, you're talking about primarily small liberal arts institutions. Their missions are comparable to small private liberal arts institutions that are not HBCUs. So it's a little bit a little bit misleading to suggest that the typical HBCU should attempt to emulate the top tier institutions at large in the nation. Perhaps a better question might be to look at comparable institutions to HBCUs that have similar missions as HBCUs or as some HBCUs, and to strive to be the best in that group of institutions. You will find also that it is quite difficult for institutions, particularly small private institutions, to mount the kinds of research agendas that put institutions in the top tier. So what you find is liberal arts institutions facing more the issue of teaching rather than research. And that's going to be one of the distinguishing features between the HBCUs and the other institutions in the United States. I think it's important to mention, though, that HBCUs have, in some instances, begun to mount significant research agendas. And you find that in a select number of private institutions, there may be as many as a half dozen of them that have begun research missions and have graduate students to help support that mission. And you find it also in some of the state-supported HBCUs, where there are probably, again, about 4 or 5 of them that are noted for their research efforts and for getting federal funding to support research.
So if I hear you correctly, Dr. Irvin, comparing, HBCUs, just to other higher education institutions, it's not apples to apples. It's more like apples and oranges.
That is correct.
The reason I'm asking like this is because, especially, these days with us going back into another, political season, the perception is not out there that it's apples or oranges. We're being judged in a lot of times by the same standards that, our peers, or whether or not our peers, are judged by.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things, that the messages that we have to get across to the larger public. It's been portrayed as being all institutions are rooted the same way and have the same kinds of resources to do the same things. And that simply is just not true. Institutions are guided by their respective missions. And if your mission is to reach first generation undergraduate students, and to ensure that that group of persons has an entree into the mainstream of society, that is quite different if you're from those institutions that are primarily serving students who are not in that group, who are third, fourth generation and already have some entree into the mainstream of society.
Dr. Irvin, I want to switch gears right quick, just a little bit, that is. In your experience, having surveyed and worked with, your recent experience, that is, having surveyed and worked with a wide array of institutions, what have you noticed in your what have you noticed recently that HBCUs are not getting enough credit for, within the higher ed space, so to speak?
Again, I guess I would go back to something that borders on my last comment. I think HBCUs are not getting credit for what they do with the students that they do serve.
Yeah.
We need more research that points to the successes of students who are first generation, low income, around the nation, who are at HBCUs and who are not at HBCUs. I think the research would demonstrate that HBCUs have done an outstanding job with students who require more, whose education has to have a substantial amount of student services. And they are doing, these institutions, HBCUs, are doing this work with limited resources.
And from that same vantage point, Dr. Irvin, what have you noticed about HBCUs in general that we as alums and supporters should be concerned about? Alums
and supporters should be concerned about their level of support of these institutions. I think one of the areas where alums and supporters could be very helpful is in providing more resources to these schools. And by resources, I don't mean just funds, because I do think that alums could contribute more funds. But there are other ways of demonstrating support for HBCUs by looking at successes that they are having and focusing on those kinds of successes rather than focusing on things that are not quite as we would like them to be. But resources, of course, but being supportive, including sending our students who are not first-generation students to our HBCUs. That's one of the challenges I think I would issue to many alums, and that is to send their sons and daughters to the schools that they attended.
Creating more legacies at HBCUs.
More legacies and more, at least the perception of value from alums. If alumni are more supportive in terms of sending their own relatives to HBCUs, I think the value of the institutional experience will be more obvious and will be picked up on by the media and some of the other institutions, public or private, that shape higher education.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Irvin, as we as we move on and go into a new academic year, do you have any final words of advice, from especially as a former HBCU president, to the HBCU community?
One of the things that HBCU faculty and staff often joke about is the need to wear several hats on a particular campus, where the staffing is not as large as we would like to be, and that people find themselves doing jobs in a number of different areas. I don't think that's likely to go away, but I think it is important that as we go forward, that we really get a commitment from those who come to work in HBCUs to improving the efficiency of operations and improving the outcomes for students, because in the end, that's what it's about. As institutions are being judged, they are being judged by the students that they graduate and what they're able to do once they finish undergraduate education and then go on to graduate or professional school. So that's got to be the focus. I would say financially, because that's always a challenge, that institutions have to find ways of living within their means. In today's society, students coming out of high school are looking for environments that are quite expensive to maintain. And HBCUs can find themselves diverting funds that should be going to educational programs to some of the amenities that students are demanding. Yeah. And that's a challenge, because you want the enrollment to grow. And you know that one of the things that attract enrollment is what students find in the way of activities outside of the classroom. But to be able to manage that in a way that you don't distract from the educational program is an art. And I think that's one of the things that institutions will have to focus on going forward.
Well, Dr. Irvin, thanks a lot for this conversation. This was really good and really helpful. And you have a great day out there in Atlanta, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
This is Thomas Joyner Jr., and you're listening to the new HBCU Ubiquity. Welcome back to the new HBCU Ubiquity podcast. First off, I want to thank Dr. Larry Irvin for taking the time to break down the mechanics of what makes great institutions such great institutions. Always a pleasure to speak with Dr. Irvin and to hear his knowledge. Now, I'm sure you've noticed that the fall semester has begun, and that means that college sports is once more upon us. And now, contrary to popular beliefs, HBCU sports is more than just football and basketball, even though our schools excel in both and still have the best halftime shows. And some of you might recall the baseball team at your alma maters, or the track and field teams, or the soccer teams. But it's good to see our schools expanding their sports offerings and in some cases taking advantage of new trends in technology. I don't know if you've heard, but Hampton is currently adding not only an esports lab on the campus, but also a new track, or some call it a new concentration, in esports in their sports management graduate program. And before I forget, word to Harvey. Also, word to Steph Curry for his donation to establish a Division I golf team with scholarships at Howard University. To the best of my knowledge, no other HBCU is doing esports like Hampton, but we do have a few other HBCU golf teams, and that includes Alcorn State and Florida A&M. In fact, shout out to all of our non-traditional sports at HBCUs, and that includes the bowling teams at University of Maryland Eastern Shore and Bowie State. And a big shout out to the Morehouse rugby team. I like the growing diversity in HBCU sports, as a continued means of attracting more students, and not just black students, to continue the legacy of our schools. Sports offers opportunities to show pride in your HBCU or whatever school you went to. Sports help both students and alumni connect and engage with their schools. Sports are also an opportunity for funding for our schools, whether through ticket sales, sponsorships, and donations for things such as scholarships. Those scholarships that will allow for students, black and non-black, that may not be able to attend or even consider our HBCUs otherwise. And we'll see how this affects Hampton in the next year or two now that they've added triathlon to their varsity offerings. Yes, you heard that right. Hampton Triathlon. Word to Harvey. Now, can we get an HBCU to offer acrobat and tumbling scholarships? You know, the cheerleaders need love too. But with the esports piece, Hampton is betting that scholarship offerings and additional university engagement by gamers will ultimately enhance their STEM fields of study. And I bet that they're right. Obviously, I digress quite a bit here. But hey, we must continue to support and encourage our historically black colleges and universities to evolve with the times. I'm Thomas Joyner Jr., and I want to thank you for joining me this week for another episode of the new HBCU Ubiquity podcast. Take care, and let's talk again on next week.
Sign up and be a part of the team. Be a Podotron at Podotron.com. Thank you for listening to Podotron.